Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see me and hear me well. We're just working to get some slides up at the moment, but those will come up very shortly. So I wanted to say a very warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Hannah Swee, and I'm a climate change expert with the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, or ICAT. And it's really great to have you joining us today for this webinar to launch the ICAT Climate Finance Transparency Guide. So just before we begin, a quick note on some of the practical aspects of this webinar. As you might be able to see at the bottom of your screen, there is a small globe icon, and we actually have interpretation for today's session in French and Spanish. So if you click down there, you can choose the language of your preference. We will also include some instructions as well coming up in the slide and also in the chat for anyone who needs a little bit of extra assistance with getting the interpretation. So as you may also have already noticed, you are muted with your camera off. So if you do have any questions, comments, or you want to get in touch with us, please do so through the Q&A function that you'll also see at the bottom of your screen. So you just click that button and you can submit your questions there throughout the webinar. We will also be checking it throughout. So you can use that function to get in touch. In terms of the agenda today, so we have quite a full agenda, and this really reflects a lot of the different aspects of the work that's gone into the development of this guide. So we wanted to ensure that the guide that we're launching today would be not only technically robust, but also accessible, meeting the needs of different countries. And in the same vein, I'm also really pleased to be able to highlight that the guide is currently available in English, but a Spanish version will be available very soon in mid-December. And a French version is also being currently prepared and will be available soon, early next year. So to start with, there will be some opening words by Henning Rooster, the director of ICAT. This will then be followed by the first presentation, giving a brief overview of the Climate Finance Transparency Guide. We'll then hear about the country applications, including some specific experiences from Côte d'Ivoire. There will then be an opportunity to answer some questions before a more in-depth technical discussion on the guide. And finally, there'll also be some time at the end for a few more questions before closing remarks. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Henning to say some opening words to start this webinar. Over to you, Henning.
Jesus, we're having just a couple of technical issues on this side. Give us a minute. Yes.
So I don't know whether you can actually see us here.
We can see you.
You cannot see me?
Yes,
we can.
We can
See you.
Good. We're having some little technical challenges, but I'm very pleased to connect for this very important launch of our new guide, which is focused on climate finance transparency. I mean, many of you have come back from COP29 just now, and you will certainly, in any case, have noticed that COP29 was dubbed the Finance COP, with climate finance very high up on the agenda. And I'm sure many of you also are not that enthusiastic about the outcomes. I know many were disappointed with the outcomes of COP29 on climate finance. But one thing that has become clear is that climate finance has many dimensions. It is to be seen as something that has, of course, a global and international importance. It has very much domestic aspects. It's a private, public matter, and it has various shades of blended finance. And this notion of the multidimensional nature of climate finance was something that guided us when we were developing the Climate Finance Transparency Guide that we are launching today. The guide comes at an important time. We come out of a COP that was focused on climate finance, and countries are entering a year when they have to update their NDCs. And climate finance is, of course, absolutely critical as countries embark on that. Before I go into that, let me just say a few words about ICCAT in case among you there are some that are new to ICCAT. So ICCAT is the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and I want to acknowledge the support that we have from our donors that make our work possible. Let me highlight our key donors: Austria, Canada, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIF, Germany, and Italy. ICCAT offers tailored support to developing countries, and we accompany that with practical tools and methodologies to build the robust transparency frameworks that are needed for climate action to be effective. Effective to meet the Paris Agreement objectives, and also effective to be in line with national development priorities. ICCAT tools and methodologies are central to what we offer. The ICCAT series of 10 policy assessment guide is a flagship example of what we are enhancing, and the guide that we are launching today is another example in this context. The guide on climate finance transparency that we are launching was developed with the support of CCAP, Greenwork, and Gauss International, and you will hear from each of those partners, and I want to thank them for their support over the last few years. Transparency is now clearly recognized as a key element of the climate process. This year was the year of the BTRs, and we are seeing more and more BTRs being submitted. Next year will be the year of the NDCs, where all countries are required to submit an updated or a new NDC, and transparency is central to both of these processes. Transparency, that's the data, information, and analysis that is really essential for planning climate actions, for tracking the implementation, and for evaluating it to strengthen actions further. Transparency provides the basis to engage stakeholders and build trust. And what is central to today's discussion, transparency is key to mobilizing resources and critical to climate finance planning and management. So this is not something that you want to leave to foreign consultants, which means that you need to invest in building capacity and building a framework for climate finance transparency at the national level. And this is what the guide that we are launching today will help countries to do. And ICCAT is available to support countries in applying it. The climate finance transparency framework gives countries the information needed to understand their national climate finance landscape. And I am sure very few countries can actually say that for themselves. And even advanced countries are struggling with understanding the national climate finance landscape. So there's no need to shy away from acknowledging that this is work that needs to be done. What does it mean? It means understanding the climate finance needs, which is the costs of NDC implementation. It is understanding the financial flows domestically and internationally, private and public, the full landscape of climate finance flows, and then using that information to assess the climate finance gaps. This provides the basis for developing a national climate finance strategy, an evidence-based approach to mobilizing finance, including how to combine different sources of finance. Additionally, a climate finance transparency framework supports a coordinated approach to engaging national stakeholders, also those from the financial sector. And it provides a basis to redefine or to refine the institutional arrangements on climate finance. All of these are aspects that are critical to building trust and confidence of investors and other stakeholders. With the climate finance transparency framework in place, countries will be able to enhance their new or updated NDCs next year with realistic implementation plans that reflect the financial needs, and then create the investment plans that provide a solid foundation for effective implementation. As you will hear from the next speakers at today's webinar, the ICCAT Climate Finance Transparency Guide provides a step-by-step approach to building a national climate finance transparency framework. It was developed over several years of work with input and review by many climate finance experts. It captures learning from several climate finance transparency country projects, most notably in Belize, Côte d'Ivoire, Morocco, and Senegal. And we will hear about some of these country experiences later in this session. And it is built in a way that allows adjusting the approach to different realities, of a wide range of countries, including those that are already advanced and those that are just getting started. I strongly believe that this guide will make a significant contribution to putting the global discussions on climate finance on a stronger foundation. More solid and granular information on the climate finance landscape in countries across the world will help to build the trust and confidence and help to advance financial flows, pushing the world closer to achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. I thank you all for joining and look forward to hearing your feedback during the discussion sessions or later on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Henning, for the opening words. And I think you've highlighted some really important points about the guide, why we've developed it, the importance of meeting these different realities, and the importance of, I think, transparency in this context of climate finance. And that leads us really well into the first presentation, which will give an overview and introduction to the guide. For this presentation, I'm really pleased to introduce Sebastian Lema, who is the Climate Finance and Carbon Markets Director at the Center for Clean Air Policy, or CCAP, where he is responsible for leading the advisory on carbon markets and access to climate finance resources. So Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you very much, Henning, for your introduction. Yeah, so before to start the presentation, I would like to acknowledge all the different participants that were involved to develop this guide. Of course, like the confidence from ICCAT to implement this project, and also our partners from the Greenwork and Gauss International, as well as different climate finance experts and country experts, country officials that provided valuable feedback during the development of this framework. And I think that's something important to mention. Why did it take almost more than 2 years to develop this guide? Is because it is really difficult to propose a one single framework that is enough flexible to be adapted to the different needs and priorities of countries to track climate finance, but also that could provide additional support not only to track climate finance and report to the UNFCCC, but also that could be used for internal purposes that I think is one of the main objectives. So we are going to split the presentation of the guide in 2 presentations. So I'm going to present a general overview and guiding principles of the guide. And then my colleague Michael from the Greenwork is going to present a more detailed steps of the guide. So I ask all the participants to stay until the end of the webinar. Okay. So now moving into the presentation. So here, I mean, is basically understand why it's relevant to have a climate finance transparency framework. within a country. So we divided it into like a categories, at domestic level and international level. So the domestic level, of course, it is important to have like a transparency. Why? Because, for example, civil society organization are asking information on climate finance. So basically, where like the country is investing climate finance, how much money is the country receiving from international donors, and as well for like a private sector, and even also for like the government institution. It's very important to know how much money are we investing and how is this money invested. Basically, because why cannot be like a content cannot be improved. Second, to identify gaps in climate finance. This is something that is usually connected to the development of like a climate finance strategy within a country, because basically you start estimating, okay, how much money does the country need to implement or to achieve like the NDCs or long-term strategies? And second, how much money is the country currently investing? And based on that difference, it is possible to estimate what is the climate finance gap at a country level. And from that, like a country can start to develop like a specific climate strategy to close that gap. Finally, like a third element at domestic level, and I think that's one of the most important one, is to optimize resource management for climate finance. Like one clear example is when you have like an estimation of what are like the sectors or regions within a country with the largest greenhouse gas emissions, and when you compare that with the climate finance investment for mitigation. This basically means, okay, like the investment of climate finance are aligned with those areas or like with those sectors with the most emission, or the same for adaptation, which is basically where the regions that are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change within a country, and if the climate investment are aligned with those regions or with that population that is most vulnerable to climate change. At the international level, we have one, of course, like reporting to the UNFCCC. That is, of course, like a key element, and I think like different countries are now like preparing for like the BTR that include like the climate finance needs, and also like the climate finance support received. The second one is to contribute like a harmonized methodology to track climate finance, because I think it's important to consider like both sides of the coin. One is to identify how much money like the developed countries are reporting in terms of climate finance contribution. But in the other side, it is important to compare that information with the reporting from like the recipient countries and identify both information is alike. And finally, to contribute to the achievement of the 2.1C of the Paris Agreement. That is basically to align like the the financial flows to climate change. Now, we also include some considerations that you will identify in the different steps of the guide. So one is like a ready-to-use guidance for developing countries, and for that we have proposed like a different methodologies and tools. That is like a step-by-step process, and also like a specific methodologies that can be applied for like the different steps. So it's basically even if it's like a country that already implemented like any kind of climate finance tracking system, or the country just going to start this process, like the guide is ready to use. The second one, that is the compatibility with other key transparency frameworks. So for that, we conducted an analysis of the different frameworks for climate finance tracking. We try to align those, like the guide, with those existing ones. And finally, to understand that this is like an evolving process. So as you are going to see in the next presentation, is like a cycle that goes from 1 to 5. So the idea is that it's like a process that it will be repeated every year or every 2 years, or depending on the preference of the country. And every time that is repeated, it's expected that it will increase like the transparency. In terms of principles, we include like three main principles within the guide. One is maximizing or like considering like the granularity. It basically means like at what level of detail like a country want to report climate finance. It can be like a very general level when we're talking like about like a budget level, or it can go at like a project level, or even a more detailed level when it goes up to like activity levels within a project. So of course it depends also on the preference and capacities of each country. The second one is avoid double counting. That is like a common challenge when we talk about transparency. And a specific example of double counting in climate finance can be identified, for example, when you receive like a climate finance from like a donor country, and it is counted as climate finance at international from international cooperation, but then the money goes into the public budget and can be counted again as like a domestic investment in climate finance. So it's basically to have like a system that could identify like the different steps or different points where like a climate finance is tracked in order to avoid that double counting. And finally, like flexibility. We understand there are like a different needs, different priorities in countries to implement a climate finance transparency framework. And according to that, we are trying to adapt the guide in order to adjust to those priorities. So for that reason, we propose like a 25 steps within the guide, but we understand that some countries have already implemented some of those steps, or some countries doesn't want to go to the overall framework. So we allow that flexibility. And the third element that is like another important point for the development of the guide is like the complexity level approach, which basically is to identify different levels of complexity to implement the different steps of the guide. So one specific example is for like the climate finance definition. So we can go from like a level 1, that is like the first approach, when a country basically use like an international definition or methodology for climate finance and for classifying like sectors on climate finance activities. The second one is to develop like a comprehensive climate finance definition adapted to the local circumstances or to the national circumstances. And in this step, like the country creates its own definition for climate finance. And finally, probably like the most complex one, is something that is usually aligned with the taxonomies, where the country conduct like a approach to establish specific activities or even sub-activities for climate finance according to the national circumstances and priorities for each country. Here you have like the 5 steps that I mentioned at the beginning, and you can see there's like a cycle that start with the scope and planning, then to identify and classifying climate finance, then to conduct like the ex-ante climate finance needs assessment. So it's basically how much money does the country need to achieve their NDCs or climate commitments. Fourth element is to implement like a climate finance tracking system. And the fifth element is to identify like the climate finance gap and secure like the additional mobilization of climate finance fund, and finally to report to the UNFCCC, and finally prepare to the next cycle. And here you can check you can download the guide, but I'm sure that after this webinar you will be able to receive like the additional details to download the guide. So thank you very much. In case of any question, we're going to have some room after like a couple of presentations. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sebastian. And just a note that we will put the QR code up at the end of the webinar as well, and we'll also send a link around to everyone who's participating too. So you'll be able to find the guide. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Sebastian for that overview as well. It's really not easy to do, I can appreciate, in 10 minutes, but we will also have another presentation later on in the webinar where we'll have a chance to go into each of those phases and steps in greater detail. I know some of you have joined just recently, so also note that on interpretation, you can find French and Spanish interpretation down the bottom of your screen. If you click on the globe icon, there are also some instructions in the chat. And please feel free to submit questions as well in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that says Q&A, and you can submit those questions there. We'll take them a little bit later. So in parallel with the development of the guide, as we pointed to through the webinar, we've also had a series of country applications. And I'd like to now introduce Sander Ackermans, who is a principal environmental consultant at Gauss International Consulting, where he supports countries in establishing national climate finance transparency systems, developing NDC financing strategies and investment plans, and creating tailored resource mobilization strategies. And Sander will give an overview on some of those country applications. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So what Hannah was already saying, an important part of the process of the development of this ICAT Climate Finance Transparency Guide was the simultaneous implementation of these country projects in 4 different countries, in Belize, Morocco, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. And during the development of this guide, these 4 countries were already using parts of this guide and providing key inputs and feedback, which also led to the ultimate final version of this ICAT Climate Finance Transparency Guide. So from Gauss' side, we're very happy to be here today and share some of these key experiences from these country applications. During this first presentation, this is more of a, let's say, a high-level presentation where we've showcased a bit of the process on this country application, so the scope of the country application, and then some key takeaways and lessons learned from the 4 countries. And then after this, we're lucky and we're very happy to be here today also with Ivory Coast, who will share some more specific country experiences and lessons learned from their side, and that will be facilitated by my colleague Peppa. So first of all, like I said, during this first presentation, some overview of the process and some key takeaways and lessons learned. So in parallel with the development of the guides, ICAT and Gauss is supporting, as these 4 country projects are still ongoing, is supporting these 4 different countries in the implementation of their national climate finance transparency systems. And these different projects had several different objectives, and some key objectives are shown on the slide. These, first of all, collecting insights that fed the development and refinement of the guide. So like I said before, certain draft versions of the guide were shared internally, and feedback was obtained from these countries also during designated country feedback sessions, where they provided feedback on different elements of the guide and also different sections of the guide, for example, maybe where more support or explanations are needed, or maybe certain sections that are unclear. Then secondly, also developing tools for the standardization of the guides. So during this process, several different tools were developed to support countries in the application of the guide, such as these country baseline assessment and a default work plan. During a later presentation during this webinar, more details will be provided on these different tools that are incorporated into the guide, but the country application also played an important part in these several tools development. Then supporting the early implementation, I think this is also important for this early implementation of the guide prior to the finalization, to learn from countries when they have this guide in their possession and where it works and maybe where some more input is needed. Ensuring that the process in the 4 countries is nationally driven, while feedback was continuously provided to enhance the guide. So these projects are being implemented by national consultants. So they're nationally driven, based on the specific needs and circumstances in each of these countries. Each of these countries has a different starting point, but each of these countries will be implementing different parts of the guide, maybe all the different steps. For other countries, only certain steps based on their national circumstances, and providing technical support and participating in workshop and capacity building activities when needed. So when countries require some additional support or trainings, this was provided and is being provided during this country application of the guide. So yeah, while the projects are country driven and implemented by these national technical consultants, technical support by GAUS is being provided continuously throughout this entire process through update meetings, participation in workshops, provision of capacity building, and review of reports and outputs throughout this entire development stage. The four countries are participating in the project. As I mentioned, this is Belize, Morocco, Senegal, and Ivory Coast, each with varying levels of implementation regarding their national climate finance transparency systems. This is what I said before. Not every country is at a different stage. Each country has their specific national circumstances, and each country has a different starting point. However, all the four countries, prior to the start of these country-driven projects, were already at a certain level already initiated the implementation of their national systems. So they required support for the continued implementation based on their national priorities and needs. And this experience has been providing key insights on how to use specific parts of the guide while identifying main challenges in countries with different national circumstances. So this is also very important why these country projects were being implemented during the development of the guide, to understand how countries in different situations could use the guide or different parts of the guide, and provide feedback in that regard. And this is also, like I said, this was done through country feedback sessions with these different countries where with GAUS and CCAP, we sat together and talked to the countries where further development of the guide was needed. So throughout this process, some key takeaways and lessons learned can be highlighted. So this first slide is more on the development and implementation of national climate finance transparency systems themselves. And then afterwards, I'll also showcase some specific key takeaways for the guide. But first, there are some valuable lessons learned regarding the development and implementation of national climate finance transparency systems. First of all, build from existing efforts and achievements regarding climate finance mechanisms and transparency systems, and leverage parallel MRV efforts. So this is also very important why this baseline assessment, one of the tools of the guide to support countries, is critical to understand existing information flows, institutional arrangements, any processes in the country, and build upon them, strengthen them, and where there are certain barriers, to address those barriers. Then initiate stakeholders from the onset to ensure appropriation of the results, resulting structure and commitment to participate once the transparency system is in place. So this is why these inception workshops are very important, to make sure that there's stakeholder awareness, and also to build awareness, and ensuring that expertise, needs, and concerns are being addressed or are being met. Then foster a high-level political buy-in and commitments to send a strong signal for a robust climate finance transparency system. Continuous capacity assessment and capacity building at the individual, institutional, and system levels. So to all continuously provide technical support. To build a sustainable system by fostering synergies and embracing simplicity as a key element. So this is to start with something. Nothing is perfect the first time, but it's always important to start building an initial system, and then there's always room for improvement. And understanding and promoting the added value of climate finance transparency beyond meeting international reporting requirements. So of course, an important part is meeting reporting requirements for climate finance transparency, but to also assess how this can benefit countries at the national level, So that is another important key takeaway. Then moving on to some important lessons learned regarding the use of the guide itself. So the guide, what we have learned from the implementation of these country projects is that the guide serves as a very practical and important resource, offering comprehensive understanding for establishing a national climate finance transparency system. It provides a methodological guidance and framework to establish and operate these systems, which was showcased by these countries. But there's some training sessions led by experts on implementing the guide can support the country application. Furthermore, complementing the guide with tailored assistance for developing countries to identify relevant forces aligned with their national context and can further enhance the application. And lastly, also to encourage knowledge sharing among countries that have utilized the guide to foster collaboration and mutual learning. So between countries now, in this instance, Morocco, Belize, Senegal, and Ivory Coast, there have already been sessions during the country application where these 4 countries have sat together and shared knowledge and shared experiences in implementing the guide. So those are some key takeaways and lessons learned on the use of the guide itself. And with that high-level overview of the application process, the process itself, and some high-level key takeaways and lessons learned, I will hand it over to I guess I'll hand it over to Hannah for a short introduction, but my colleague Peppa afterwards will facilitate the session on more country-specific context with Ivory Coast to share some country experiences at the country level. So thank you all very much, and I'll hand it over to you, Hannah.
Great, thank you, Sander. I think we can move on then to Peppa, who will also engage with Mohamed Sanogo from Côte d'Ivoire. Over to you, Peppa.
Thank you, Hannah. Je vais parler en français pour introduire la Côte d'Ivoire. Je voulais commencer par vous remercier pour votre participation dans ce webinaire si important pour l'action climatique. Et vous dire que, comme mon collègue Sander a présenté, la Côte d'Ivoire est un des 4 pays de l'ICAD qui est en train d'implémenter le cadre de la transparence sur la finance climatique. Et même si la Côte d'Ivoire a commencé très récemment, au courant du mois d'août, à implémenter les projets, ils sont déjà des très bonnes pratiques à nous partager concernant l'implémentation du projet, comme un fort engagement de toutes les parties prenantes. On a eu une question dans les chats sur à qui les guides étaient destinés, et en fait à toutes les parties prenantes qui ont un rôle à jouer dans les financements climatiques, et aussi une bonne pratique due au fait que le pays est en train de travailler en synergie avec d'autres partenaires comme les fonds mondiaux et internationaux. Donc, j'ai l'énorme plaisir de vous présenter Monsieur Mohamed Sanogo, le coordinateur du programme national changement climatique de la Côte d'Ivoire, qui va nous partager l'expérience de la Côte d'Ivoire jusqu'à maintenant, et vous demander de n'hésiter pas à profiter de cette occasion pour lui poser des questions après sa présentation. Donc, à vous la parole, Hannah, pour l'introduction, et à M. Sanogo pour l'expérience de la Côte d'Ivoire. Merci pour votre attention.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Est-ce que tout le monde m'entend?
Oui.
Oui, merci beaucoup à PayPal pour cette introduction. Je suis donc Mohamed Sanogo, coordonnateur du programme national changement climatique au sein du ministère de l'Environnement, du Développement durable et de la transition écologique. Et par la même occasion, point focal transparence climatique en lien avec l'article 13 de l'accord de Paris et également donc coordonnateur sur le projet ICAT mis en œuvre donc en Côte d'Ivoire au même titre que le Maroc et le Sénégal, comme l'ont précisé les interlocuteurs précédents. Très rapidement, ma présentation s'articule comme plan autour de ces points. Je vais vous faire très rapidement un petit rappel de contexte sur la CDN de la Côte d'Ivoire. Et avant de revenir donc sur la mise en œuvre du projet ICAT, notamment la signature de la convention, et rappeler un peu donc les activités qui ont été réalisées, mais également faire une liaison entre la mise en œuvre du projet ICAT en Côte d'Ivoire et la facilité résilience et durabilité du Fonds monétaire international et conclure à travers donc quelques défis et évoquer les prochaines étapes dans la mise en œuvre donc, de ICAT en Côte d'Ivoire. Donc, au niveau du contexte, donc notre pays, la Côte d'Ivoire, a révisé ses CDN en 2022, soumis à la Convention, avec une ambition rehaussée de réduire donc ses émissions de 30,41% à l'horizon 2030. Je précise que cet objectif de réduction est inconditionnel, puisqu'avec l'objectif conditionnel, nous montons à 98,85%. Terme de coût lié à la mise en œuvre des CDN, elle est estimée donc à 2 milliards US, avec 12 milliards pour le volet adaptation et 10 milliards pour le volet atténuation. Ces coûts, nous les avons obtenus grâce à l'appui du projet CBIT qui a été mis en œuvre en Côte d'Ivoire, projet sur lequel d'ailleurs le cabinet GOS a également travaillé, ce qui a permis de faire l'évaluation financière de la CDN de la Côte d'Ivoire. Pour aller rapidement sur le projet ICAT, donc nous avons identifié le projet ICAT lors des COP précédentes et des discussions ont commencé et ont abouti à la signature d'une convention entre ICAT et le gouvernement de Côte d'Ivoire en décembre 2023, convention signée par le représentant de ICAT ici en Côte d'Ivoire, l'UNOPS, et par le ministre des Finances et du budget de la Côte d'Ivoire. Et après la signature de cette convention, un arrêté interministériel signé par le ministre de l'Environnement et le ministre des Finances a été pris en mars 2024. Et sur la base de cet arrêté, une unité de gestion de projet a été mise en place. Cette unité de gestion de projet, comme je l'ai dit, est coordonnée par moi-même, mais nous avons également un coordonnateur adjoint au sein du ministère des Finances et du Budget. À la suite de la mise en place de cette unité de gestion de projet, une équipe technique nationale a été recrutée. Cette équipe est supervisée justement par le cabinet GOS. Elle est constituée de 5 experts, un expert en finance climat, un expert en finances publiques, un expert en gouvernance, un expert juridique et 2 experts, un atténuation et un adaptation. Donc, au-delà du recrutement de cette équipe technique qui est recrutée et supervisée par le cabinet GOS pour favoriser la compréhension et l'adhésion, je dirais, des ministères sectoriels concernés par la CDN. On a donc procédé à la désignation de points focaux au sein donc des différentes structures qui sont concernées par la mise en œuvre des contributions déterminées au niveau national. Donc, ce slide vous présente plus ou moins un bref aperçu des points focaux, comme je l'ai dit, les différents ministères concernés par la mise en œuvre des CDN, mais également 2 ministères clés que sont le ministère des Finances et du Budget et le ministère de l'Économie, du Plan et du Développement, mais également les acteurs du secteur privé, de la société civile, des partenaires. PayPal est revenu tout à l'heure sur le fait que nous sommes en synergie avec d'autres partenaires techniques et financiers qui sont également sur des systèmes MRV sectoriels. mais également une représentation des points focaux des mécanismes financiers ici en Côte d'Ivoire. Le lancement officiel du projet ICAT s'est fait donc en août, Pépa l'a rappelé, et vous avez quelques images. Et ce lancement a été présidé par monsieur le directeur de cabinet du ministre de l'Environnement. Après le lancement du projet, il faut dire qu'au niveau du plan de travail du ICAT, nous avons 4 phases dans le plan de travail. Et à cette date, nous sommes à la phase 2, je dirais à mi-parcours de la phase 2, la phase 1 étant achevée et ayant produit certains livrables importants, notamment le premier livrable qui était donc le rapport sur l'évaluation de base, et ce conformément justement au guide qui a été présenté, ce qui a permis de faire la cartographie des instruments juridiques, techniques et financiers en matière de finances climatiques et l'analyse situationnelle de ces instruments en Côte d'Ivoire, mais également l'identification du paysage du financement climatique et la cartographie des parties prenantes. Ça, c'est ce qui concerne le premier livrable. Le second livrable a concerné donc en un atelier d'engagement des parties prenantes, justement, et cet atelier a fait l'objet d'un rapport qui a été transmis donc à l'UNOPS. Sur la seconde phase que nous avons également démarrée, il s'agit donc d'harmoniser les définitions et les sources de données pour le suivi du financement climatique, mais également de développer une méthodologie de marquage des dépenses d'investissement liées au climat. Et le second livre,
On vous a perdu, Monsieur Sanero.
donc sur la base de la méthodologie qui a été développée pour le système de marquage des investissements liés au climat, un arrêté ministériel établissant donc ce système de marquage a été pris donc par Madame la ministre de l'économie, du plan et du développement. Là, je vous présente quelques images justement de cet atelier qui s'est tenu sur à peu près 3 jours, avec donc des séances en plénière, mais également des travaux de groupe et tout ça supervisé par évidemment le cabinet GOS qui accompagne la Côte d'Ivoire à la mise en œuvre de ICAT. La liaison avec la facilité résilience et durabilité du FMI, qui est une fenêtre que le FMI a mis en place très récemment pour justement accompagner les pays qui manifestent l'intérêt à soutenir leur économie. Et c'est le cas pour la Côte d'Ivoire, pour améliorer donc sa résilience face au changement climatique. Notre pays a identifié cette facilité afin de mettre en œuvre des politiques et réformes nécessaires pour soutenir la stabilité prospective de la balance de paiement, mais également pour faire face aux défis structurels à plus long terme économiques liés au changement climatique. Ainsi, un accord au titre de cette facilité portant sur la mise en œuvre d'un paquet de réformes, de mesures de réforme, a été conclu en mars 2024 en complément du programme économique et financier conventionnel que notre pays a avec le FMI, qui lui avait été conclu en mai 2023. Et ces mesures de réforme, au total, il y en a 16, tournent autour de 6 axes. Le premier axe étant l'intégration du climat dans la gestion des finances publiques. Le deuxième axe, le renforcement de la gouvernance des politiques climatiques. Le troisième axe, la réduction de la vulnérabilité du secteur agricole, puisque notre pays, comme vous le savez, a une économie qui est fortement basée sur l'agriculture, notamment la cacaoculture, où notre pays est premier producteur mondial. Le quatrième axe, qui est l'accroissement donc des financements verts et climatiques. Le cinquième, la réduction de la vulnérabilité aux inondations et à l'érosion côtière. Et le 6e axe, évidemment, la réduction ou la limitation des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Mais il va se dire que pour la mise en œuvre de ces 16 mesures de réforme, notre pays avait besoin d'assistance et certaines mesures de réforme bénéficieront de l'assistance du FMI, du groupe de la Banque mondiale ou de la Banque africaine de développement. Mais nous avons échangé justement avec le cabinet GOS qui a bien voulu prendre en charge certaines mesures de réforme. Et le prochain slide reviendra là-dessus. Mais l'enjeu avec la FRD, c'est surtout les acquis financiers qui sont derrière, puisque la réalisation de ces 16 mesures de réforme permettent à notre pays de bénéficier d'un montant de 1,3 milliard de dollars sur la période 2024-2026, en complément donc, comme je l'avais dit, du programme économique et financier qui lui-même était de 3,5 milliards de dollars. Et aujourd'hui, les revues se font conjointement, la revue du programme économique et financier conventionnel et la revue du FRD, puisque le mémorandum qui a été signé conditionnalise les décaissements du programme économique et financier par la réalisation de la FRD, où justement ICAT intervient au travers justement de la réalisation de 3 mesures de réforme. Donc, pour revenir sur les mesures de réforme prises en charge par ICAT, elles concernent justement l'axe 1 que j'ai cité précédemment et l'axe 4, notamment l'intégration du climat dans la gestion des finances publiques, mais également l'accroissement de la mobilisation des finances vertes et climatiques. Et à ce titre-là, justement, le développement du système de marquage qu'a permis de faire le projet ICAT est l'un des indicateurs réalisés, mais également au titre de l'accroissement de la mobilisation de financement, l'équipe technique nationale supervisée par ICAT a donc élaboré un plan de formation sur les instruments de finance climat, la taxonomie et les cadres de reporting portant sur les risques climatiques, mais également une plateforme finance climat et durable a été donc développée. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui.
Excusez-moi, voilà. Donc, voilà quelques acquis qu'ont permis, je dirais, le ICAT pour le moment sur ces 2 mesures, les 3 mesures de réforme du FMI. Mais je rappelle que là, c'est des indicateurs intermédiaires. Donc, nous continuerons à travailler avec le cabinet GOS pour justement être à jour sur les indicateurs que nous devons réaliser. Quoique la finalité du projet ICAT, c'est justement d'aboutir à un système MRV, un cadre de transparence au niveau de la finance climat, conformément donc aux exigences de la Convention cadre et en liaison avec l'article 13 de l'accord de Paris. En tout état de cause, l'outil, notamment la plateforme finance verte et durable couplée au système MRV qui seront développés, seront donc un outil de suivi et pour le gouvernement, mais également pour les partenaires au développement que sont le FMI, le groupe de la Banque mondiale et les autres partenaires bilatéraux et multilatéraux qui accompagnent notre pays et qui sont très intéressés par cet outil pour faire le suivi justement et accompagner notre pays à mobiliser le financement nécessaire à la réalisation de nos objectifs de la CDN. En termes de défis pour la suite, ça va être d'établir des accords, puisque pour réaliser justement cette plateforme, nous nous sommes basés sur les résultats d'un projet déjà mis en œuvre avec l'appui de l'Union européenne, qui a fait une première évaluation financière de l'état de la mise en œuvre de la CDN, qui nous a permis de réaliser cette plateforme. Donc, établir des accords pour la fourniture régulière de données, notamment à travers des manuels de procédure qui devront être traduits en arrêté ministériel ou interministériel pour avoir un caractère, je dirais, obligatoire, mais également développer des approches méthodologiques pour le marquage et l'évaluation des flux de financement climatique. Et c'est en cela justement que le guide que propose ICAT tombe bien. L'équipe nationale est déjà en train de s'approprier ce guide, mais nous avons fort espoir, avec l'appui technique du cabinet GOS, que nous nous approprions très rapidement ce guide. Mais également assurer la formation, le renforcement de capacités des parties prenantes nationales sur la base du guide, mais également des meilleures pratiques, notamment avec les échanges d'expériences avec les autres pays, mais aller à des exercices pilotes et définir une feuille de route pour l'implémentation et réussir la réalisation donc, des objectifs fixés dans le projet ICAT et garantir justement le cadre de transparence. En termes de perspectives, de prochaines étapes en lien avec la mise en œuvre du projet ICAT, comme je vous l'avais dit, nous sommes à mi-parcours de la phase 2. Il y a 4 phases au total. Nous sommes à mi-parcours. Et l'année prochaine, dès le début de l'année prochaine, nous allons achever cette deuxième phase à travers donc, la réalisation des activités que vous voyez, notamment l'activité en lien avec le financement climatique nécessaire, où nous allons avoir des exercices de chiffrage donc, de la CDN, mais également des sessions de formation sur le chiffrage et le matériel. Évidemment, nous allons continuer avec le financement climatique reçu. Donc, bien évidemment, voir la méthodologie d'évaluation des besoins en financement des sources nationales reçues au niveau des sources internationales, mais également suivi de sessions de formation sur les méthodologies et les outils, puisque, comme on le sait, le ICAT a également développé des outils propriétaires et notre pays est très intéressé à pouvoir bénéficier de ces outils. Donc, il y aura ces ateliers de renforcement de capacité dont bénéficieront les points focaux, comme je l'avais dit, qui ont été désignés au niveau des ministères concernés par la CDN et en tout cas tous les acteurs qui accompagnent la réalisation de la mise en œuvre de la CDN. Donc, voilà l'économie de ma présentation. Je reste éventuellement disponible pour toute question venant de la part des participants. Merci beaucoup.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed, for sharing those experiences from Côte d'Ivoire. So we have a little bit of time now for a few questions. There have been quite a few that have been submitted in the Q&A box. So I'll just take a couple and just with the note that we'll have another session on for questions at the end of the webinar as well. So we have a question here about that refers to the effective implementation of the guide and if there are any pilot phases planned to ensure the guide can work in different countries. So for this question, I'd like to hand over to Henning and see if you have any response for that.
So thank you, Hannah. The guide, I'm just confused. Which question do you want me to address?
So the question is about to ensure the effectiveness of the implementation of the guide. And this person wants to know if there are more pilot phases that are planned to ensure that,
Yes, sorry. Yeah, and so, I mean, we are having these 4 countries that Sander presented as countries that are applying the methodology, and the lessons learned from those applications have been picked up in the development of the guide. So, of course, we will continue to implement the guide, and we are ready to support other countries in implementing the guide, and we will then pick up lessons learned from further implementation. I wouldn't call additional country projects pilot phases, so and we even didn't call the country projects that we presented, pilot phases, because they were full applications of the methodology that had been developed. But as knowledge advances and the experience enhances, we will have refinements. I mean, what is important to understand is that the guide already is tailored to very different starting points and very different priorities. So it is already a very flexible framework that can be applied by many different countries with different realities and needs. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Henning. So we have another question that's about the different phases or steps within the guide. And the question is about what has required the most assistance during the country implementation. So I want to see if Sander or Mohammed, would you like to respond to that? Maybe Sander first, and then Mohammed to share your thoughts on what's required the most assistance so far in those applications in country.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, this is an interesting question, so thank you for the question. It depends on the country circumstances where the project is being implemented. So even among the 4 countries that are currently implementing their national climate finance transparency system, it varies. For some countries, this more assistance is required in the institutional setup. We do see in several of these 4 countries, we see it reflected in the climate finance needs assessments, that is an area where additional support is needed. So ultimately, it will depend on the country, and it's difficult to provide one answer related to that captures all the countries in one area of the guide, let's say. So maybe for Ivory Coast, there might be a specific area that they needed additional support.
Great, thanks. Mohammed, did you have any thoughts that you'd like to share from your experience with in your country?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Arnon. Comme je le disais tout à l'heure, notre pays a bénéficié antérieurement du projet CBIT du Fonds pour l'environnement mondial, où on a d'ailleurs bénéficié du cabinet GOS également, notamment pour l'évaluation financière de la CDN, mais faire des renforcements de capacité sur la conception du système de suivi de la mise en œuvre des contributions déterminées au niveau national. Il faut avouer que l'aspect financier nous manquait, d'où l'intérêt qu'on a eu pour l'initiative ICAT, qui était beaucoup plus portée sur les aspects financiers. Et comme je l'ai dit, au mois d'août dernier, le Fonds monétaire international a organisé une table ronde des bailleurs ici en Côte d'Ivoire, table ronde qui a regroupé tous les partenaires financiers de la Côte d'Ivoire. Et il est important pour nous de rapidement développer ce cadre de transparence afin d'établir la confiance justement avec ces bailleurs pour justement continuer à mobiliser le financement climatique pour réaliser nos objectifs de contribution déterminés au niveau national. Puisque lorsque la confiance est établie entre le pays, quand on reçoit un financement et que ce pourquoi nous avons reçu le financement est bien tracé au travers d'un outil où justement le bailleur peut observer les objectifs et la réalisation, l'atteinte de ces objectifs, cela établit une certaine confiance mutuelle entre justement les pays donateurs et encourage justement à poursuivre la collaboration. D'où l'intérêt que nous avons eu pour l'initiative ICAT qui tombait bien et qui vient combler ce vide. À l'instant où je vous parle à Abidjan, il y a l'atelier de validation du décret portant cadre de transparence climatique, dont l'une des sections est consacrée à la finance climatique, et c'est justement ICAT qui nous permettra de réaliser cet objectif-là. Merci beaucoup.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And I think that this is something that that I know I've heard from some other countries as well. So I think that yeah, really interesting to hear from Côte d'Ivoire. So I think we will stop the Q&A for now. We'll come back to it a little bit later. But now I'd like to move on to the next speaker for today, who is Michelle Kotler, who is the founding partner of the Climate Policy Advisory Network, The Green Work, where he provides expertise and advice on domestic and international climate finance architecture. And he'll be taking us through a more in-depth discussion on the Climate Finance Transparency Guide. So over to you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, and also a warm welcome from my side to all participants. So I have the pleasure now to lead you through the full cycle in a bit more detail. But before we go into the nitty-gritties of those 5 phases, 2 aspects to highlight when we look at the full cycle. So just to mention again, there are several elements described with different complexity levels. They are symbolized by those small pyramids, the small blue pyramids. For instance, the example that Sebastian presented in the beginning when it comes to the establishment of a climate finance definition, but there is more steps that are prone to very complex procedures if selected, and therefore symbolized through the pyramids. And then another aspect when you look at the cycle relates to frequency and timeline. Not all elements of the cycle need to be replicated in the same frequency. There are elements that can be conducted also in irregular timelines. For instance, the rather preparatory phases 1 and 2, but also the ex-ante climate finance needs assessment phase 3, which is usually linked to NDC updates, is rather infrequent, and then phases 4 and 5 have a more regular timeline to keep track and fulfill also reporting requirements, for example, under the UNFCCC. So let's go into the first phase, which represents actually formulating a basis for all the subsequent phases. It starts with an identification of the key stakeholders coming from the government, academia, experts, development agencies, NGOs, private sector. So the key stakeholders that are needed to set up a successful transparency framework in the long run. Then a baseline assessment is crucial. Here you can identify the current status of the implementation of the phases. So what exists already in your country, and also which institutional processes exist to build on. Then the objectives need to be defined that shall be achieved with the transparency framework, for example, mobilizing more resources or international reporting. Oh, sorry, I forgot to share my screen. Okay.
Would you prefer to share yourself,
Yes,
Michelle?
yes.
I can stop sharing.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
I'll stop and then you can
Apologies
share.
for that.
Okay.
Apologies for that. Of course. Here we go. Jump directly into the phase 1. So I continue with the baseline assessment, which identifies the current status of implementation and the phases and institutional processes, the objectives to be achieved. And all this flows then into a work plan with key performance indicators required and an implementation plan. So this is what the colleagues from Gauss described, what they have done with the countries, coming up with a solid work plan and then implementing certain activities. Also key is to define institutional arrangements with defined responsibilities, accountability, and the capacities of the countries that are required. And hereby both human, but also, for example, technical capacities like IT capacities need to be reflected and potentially improved through trainings or upgrades of IT systems. And concluding in this phase 1 results in strengthened institutional settings to manage and analyze and also track climate finance data within the subsequent phases. The second phase is related to the definition and classification of climate finance. You might know there is no universal definition of climate finance existing, so this is also a responsibility and sovereignty of countries to come up with a definition that fits to their context. Hereby applicable sectors, but also eligible activities from the perspective of the respective country need to be defined. The little pyramid I was talking about before, little blue pyramid, shows then the different complexity levels that can be chosen. This comprises of using existing classifications, for example, from the OECD or UNFCCC, up to, at the highest level, developing an own overarching taxonomy, for example, with all its required technical details. Further key parameters that need to be defined are the scope of sources that are covered, the granularity of reporting. Here we can distinguish, for example, between component-based and project-based reporting, whether to cover only committed or also disbursed flows, and the frequency. Finally, impact indicators can help to measure the effectiveness of the climate finance that you track at the end of the day and streamline reporting. There is a whole universe of setting up those impact indicators. We touch upon that also in the guide, but there is also more detailed methodologies described that are linked in the guide that you find there. And all those elements result then in a definition and parameters that are applied across the whole cycle. The third phase aims to quantify the needed climate finance ex ante, so projecting the climate finance requirements for the future. This relates typically to NDC or long-term strategy costing exercises that we have seen, for example, with the last round of NDCs, but many countries are working on that right now when they come up with new NDCs next year. Hereby, first, we need to set certain parameters for the needs assessment. For example, regarding the timeline, the sectors, the cost structure, but also we have to select an applicable methodology. And hereby, different models exist, top-down or bottom-up approaches, and they differ very much also in terms of their technical complexity. That goes from rather simple Excel modeling or Excel simulations up to LEAP or GACMO-based simulations, so rather sophisticated tools that are required, which is also symbolized here again by that little pyramid, that different complexity levels exist for that exercise. This results then in targets and costs or investment needs, maybe also separated by preparatory costs, CapEx, capital expenditures, or OpEx, operational expenditures. And we also have as a step here, quality control, so the validation of the numbers. At the end of the day, this results then in a cost estimation for NDC or LTS targets. The fourth phase is after financial flows have happened. So it's an ex-post tracking of the financial flows to see what has really been happening in your country. It starts with data collection and processing from all the relevant sources that you have defined in phase one, as well as the stakeholders that have been identified, and according to the classification that we were talking about in phase two. The little pyramid here shows, again, different complexity levels. It's rather straightforward based on our experience to get data from, for example, national budgets, key ministries, and also some of the off-budget data from international climate finance flows. However, it gets more complex and more time-consuming to integrate also domestic private sector flows, for example. Here you can apply surveys or at the highest level of such a pyramid, even mandatory reporting systems. The weighting of climate finance data determines how much of a project or of a component is actually climate relevant. There are different methodologies existing that we also analyzed And we provide in the guide a best practice to come up with complex but also doable weighting of climate finance data that leads to reliable results. And finally, when it comes to those tracking exercises, verification of the data is crucial to avoid, for example, double counting or inconsistencies among the data. And finally, all those elements will result in a database with solid climate finance flow information for your country. The last phase, phase 5, brings together the results of the previous phases and finally also achieves those objectives that we have talked about in phase 1. Hereby, we compare the financial needs from phase 3 with the real flows that we identified then in phase 4, and potential gaps are revealed. And to address those gaps, we can either focus on optimizing public resource management. This is one option. Reprioritization or reallocation of public funding can help to cover the gaps. But potentially the public finance will not be sufficient, and therefore mobilizing additional resources is crucial. That can come either from the private sector within the country through, for example, new policies, but also international investments or international support from private or public donors might be a solution to cover the gaps. Then one aspect that we mentioned across different phases here is the reporting under the UNFCCC. We have the enhanced transparency framework that requires biannual reporting, and developing countries are strongly encouraged to also report on the climate finance flows they receive internationally. We give guidance how to fill the associated tables under the BTR reporting in the guide, and give guidance what to consider to complete that step in best way. So finally, all those elements here in this 5th phase results in a strengthened NDC implementation with a solid financing strategy. And as a last step, we also included this evolution to the next cycle. Hereby, we suggest to evaluate the status of implementation, the experiences made when going through the cycle, and also planning for the next cycle, potentially going up complexity levels in some of those little pyramids. So to facilitate the implementation of those different steps that we have seen, the different phases that we have seen, we have also come up with several templates and tools that accompany the guide. For example, we have the country baseline assessment sheet, a flowchart, and institutional setting list, stakeholder mapping template in Microsoft Word format, a default work plan that we also used during the first implementation experiences in the countries mentioned before, and also a climate finance transparency tool, including a checklist for climate finance tracking. This tool I would briefly touch on here. It comes in Excel, would be suitable for the complexity level 1, and includes several semi-automatized spreadsheets that help to track the data, include the data into the database, and also come up with visualizations and even a first version of a BTR reporting table. So it basically supports the steps in phase 4 and 5. And finally, we also have seen that in the list of questions raised by the participants, many developing countries obviously lack sufficient resources and capacities to implement such a full transparency cycle unilaterally. Therefore, several support programs exist. A couple of those I would like to briefly mention here. First of all, the Green Climate Fund has a readiness program, and within that, NDC revision support, but also NDC costing and climate finance tracking schemes are covered and can be integrated into the readiness program. Then the Global Environment Facility, GEF, has 3 sub-programs that deal also with climate finance transparency. First of all, we see here support to elaborate UNFCCC related reports. For example, they provide support for BTR or national communication development. There is also global support for the Enhanced Transparency Framework and the so-called CIBIT program. That's the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, which offers trainings on specific topics, for example, on software usage, IPCC software, for example, quality reviews of transparency reports to enhance their quality, but also hands-on support for transparency-related measures such as filling reporting tables. And last but not least, and we have briefly touched upon that, ICAT also offers tailored support to developing countries and will also initiate a specific support program for climate finance transparency in future that helps countries as well to implement elements of this cycle that we have seen today. With that, I would come to an end. Thank you very much for your interest and participation, and would hand back to you, Hannah, for, I think, another Q&A session.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So we do have a couple of minutes for a few final questions, or maybe 1 or 2. So I just wanted to highlight again, we have some questions about the guide and the languages. So we have it currently in English. It is coming in Spanish by mid-December, so very soon, and then again in French early in 2025, so also very soon. But we've had some questions about the target audience for the guide and how countries can get assistance for applying the guide. So I want to quickly just see if Henning can provide a quick response on that.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. A quick response. Indeed, I mean, the target audience, as you have seen, is really developing country and the entities responsible in developing countries for climate finance transparency. That may be the ministry in charge of climate change, or it may be the finance ministries. And in the end, both need to be involved and collaborate together with other institutions that are responsible for climate finance in the country, including sometimes the planning ministry or whatever agencies are involved in climate finance operations. That is part of the initial setup. And if there's an interest in the country to implement the guide and the need for support, we would encourage the ministry that is interested to contact us. You can do that initially by an informal email just to get in touch with us. Eventually, we will need a formal request in the form of a formal letter, but we can discuss that when we discuss the approach. Now, that is our primary target audience, and it responds already to your second question. In terms of a wider target audience, we do believe that this can be relevant to subnational governments, and it can be adapted and applied in a mode that is adapted to the specific setup in a at a subnational level. And certainly the guide is also to be used by all the stakeholders that we have emphasized as needing to be part of the process. And I think the presenters expanded on that. But of course, that is not our primary target audience. It's a secondary target audience, since they do need to understand the approaches and principles that have been are suggested to guide any national transparency framework.
Great, thanks, Henning. So we're running out of time. So I will just say that we will respond to the rest of the questions that have come in via email, and I'll hand back to Henning for some closing remarks. Thanks.
Thank you. And I do see that time is short, so I'll keep it very short. But I do want to recognize that there were some other questions that are probably of interest to everybody. And one of them was related to assessing outcomes of climate finance. And I want to highlight that in the guide, we have emphasized the importance of defining the impact of climate finance and being very specific on that. I mean, in our support to countries on transparency in general, we emphasize a focus on assessing the impact of climate actions with a view to actually attracting climate finance. And that, of course, is something that then also needs to be done when reviewing climate finance and establishing climate finance needs. Be very clear about the expected impacts, and then ex post be clear about the achieved impacts of climate finance. So that relates to some extent to the question that was posed on outcomes. I also saw a question on the new situation on climate finance and the impact of the possibility that the United States is less engaged on climate finance. I would say the shortfall of climate finance is an encouragement to actually implement climate finance transparency, because it helps to really attract and manage climate finance in a way that combines all available sources of climate finance. And there it's important to also take into consideration domestic sources of climate finance and private climate finance. So I won't go further into this, just to reiterate that the guide is free to use for anybody. It's available on our website and soon also in Spanish and French. And as I said, ICAT is happy to support countries who wish to apply it and need support in doing so. So let me close by thanking again all the speakers, especially Sebastian from CCAP, but also his team that helped developing the guide, Michelle from Greenwork, and again, the colleagues that were involved in developing the guide, Sander and Peppa from Gauss International, my colleague Hannah, who really led the development of the guide from within the ICAT Secretariat. But again, there are many other colleagues who were involved, and I want to thank them all for the support. A big thank you to Mohamed Sanogo for his excellent presentation, and also there to the team that he's working with in Côte d'Ivoire. And finally, I don't want to end without thanking our interpreters for helping everybody to understand the presentations and the discussion. So thank you all for joining us, and please do keep in touch with us, and I hope to meet many at an opportunity not in such a big distance in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just from my side, a huge thank you again to everyone. Thank you all for staying in this webinar till the end. We will also share a recording. Thank you to all the speakers and everyone involved in the development of this guide and an application of it. So thank you all again, and wishing you all a very pleasant day or evening or morning, wherever you are. And we'll close the webinar now. Thank you. Bye.